Okay, great. So there's moving forward, right? There's a number of other parts to this course. One, of course, has to do with the lectures, the pre-recorded lecture, and those pre-recorded lectures. There's a few that are already up, and a couple of others that will come up. They'll kind of come up later on today and tomorrow. Right now, actually, if anything, the more important thing is, of course, to do, to be present for this and to continue reading. There's a couple of, I think, right, PDFs that are attached under reading number 1 in the Canvas course page, and those readings, right, it's 3 PDFs, one from John Levinson and 2 from Walter Kaiser. The 2 from Walter Kaiser are just, it's kind of a split of chapters, a couple chapters from his book, Mission in the Old Testament. Those are fairly accessible, I think much more accessible. Levinson's is slightly bit more technical and dense writing, and that one primarily deals with suzerain treaties of the ancient Near East and how similar those are to the ones, of course, that God sets up, or I should say maybe Yahweh sets up with Israel, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment with the covenants. So the context of that little section when you read it, because you're jumping in to the beginning of that book and you're not reading the entire book, is he wants to discuss what is it that is unique about the covenant that God has set up with Israel, and how is it similar to those in the surrounding cultures and civilizations, and at what point is it different? But the main point is what makes this special, what makes it unique, what is it that's unique about this suzerain treaty or suzerainty treaty that he set up. So that's just to give you some context about that. But the more important thing beyond that is after you have read that material, including the material from Dempster, you should probably take a week and a half or so to do that, is then to log on back onto the Canvas site and go to assignment number 1. And in assignment number 1, write in some responses in the course discussion. There's 4 questions in the course discussion section in the course site on Canvas. What you can do is all you have to do is you write 4 responses of a certain length, and you carry on a little conversation with some of the other students. So somebody's going to have to kick it off. Somebody's going to have to write the first response to one of those questions. Perhaps split it, 2 questions in 2 responses for one question, 2 responses for another. You can go just all out 4 responses for one of those 4 questions. But somebody's going to have to get it started, and then others can perhaps respond with their view and respond to the question. In those responses, you can take account of what somebody else has written and then also include your view if it happens to differ with theirs or complements. A lot of this, I think, will be views that kind of complement one another or elaborate on somebody else's initial write-up. Okay? So, again, make sure that you keep up with the reading. And there'll probably be some catching up to do because I know some of you have joined the course here just a few days ago. So just get on with the reading. Use some of the material that we'll discuss today to kind of supplement what you've read. But make sure that after you've read and you've digested some of the material, that you then after that can write some responses, 4 responses as part of the course requirements in the course discussion section. All you do is press the course discussion little menu option on the left-hand side or tab, and it'll lead you to the 4 questions from this section of the course to respond to. Okay, so I hope that's clear. If not, of course, you can just email me or send me a question of some kind, and I think that'll be all right. All right, so let's see. So I think we're ready to start discussing some covenants here, and in this case, even though the usual OT survey course has you discuss a number of different themes across the books, I'm going to actually focus in on a few that may be quite relevant not only to our understanding of God. A bird just appeared in front of me. That may be relevant to our understanding of God, but particularly can inform how we walk with God in our ministry. So I'd like to actually read just a couple of passages here to give us an example. And these, I think, these are passages that I think would be readily available if any of you are familiar with some biblical overviews online or in text of covenants. So we're going to first talk about covenants. And after we talk about covenants for a little while, I'm going to give you a break period to kind of reflect and write and respond to the material that I've presented on covenant. And then I'll come back and we'll go into the next section. It'll almost be kind of broken up into little 40 to 45-minute chunks. Okay, and anyway, I hope that we'll see how that works. And if it still doesn't give enough, room for reflection and such, then just let me know, and we'll adjust things for some of the future classes. All right. So, and right, I think I think one of the things to first discuss is what exactly is a covenant, and that berit. Berit is how it's pronounced in the Hebrew and how it comes out in most passages in the Old Testament. But we ask ourselves, what am I doing when I enter a covenant? We talk a lot about, in our modern context, of agreements, especially contracts, partnerships, and so forth. But you rarely ever hear anyone mention anything about a covenant. But if we're going to talk about the Old Testament, and especially about the mission of God in the world, covenant cannot be left out. You'll sometimes, if you've read people from Reformed backgrounds, especially Reformed theologians, they're very big on covenant. They write quite a bit of covenant theologies, that is, where covenant holds a very central place in everything they discuss. And in some ways, right, that emphasis is not misplaced. I mean, there's obviously a number of other things that you have to sort of, can piece together to get a kind of a firmer understanding of God's own commitment and heart in the matter. But it is important to at least get some grasp on what covenant is about, because it's a very, very fruitful and I think kind of, you could say, pregnant term that is one that has a lot of great capacity in it for shaping how we view God and how we do work with others. But people rarely ever talk about covenants. I mean, I think probably the most I hear about covenants is the word, housing covenants. Which, right, were collective agreements in a particular region for, how one was to run a neighborhood and what boundaries or limits were to be set to home design and even the behavior of people, obviously, who would lead and live in some of these neighborhoods. Housing covenants were used to kind of manipulate, the opinions of the residents in order to, exclude certain folks. Housing covenants were at times used for racist purposes. But other than that, covenant has fallen into disuse, generally speaking, but covenant was a very important kind of, you could say, social and socially binding agreement and practice in the ancient world. And there is something very powerful about it. I think there's something that's even, potentially kind of catalytic about a covenant that could set off a number of great things, and I've kind of used that language in a number of situations during my years in ministry. So let's take a look here at Genesis 21, and I was going to read another passage from earlier on in Genesis, but I think that would kind of take a little bit too much time. We're going to take a look at a few of the covenants, and I want to make it clear just from the outset before we look at the covenants that God enters into, that covenants are formed by quite a bit of people between each other, and those covenants, I think, are ones that are overlooked. I'm kind of looking at a few of them over in passing here, but I think they could be quite often overlooked. So, for example, the one between let's look at Abraham and Abimelech. Genesis 21. On the way, God has already established, in a sense, a covenant with all of creation. Don't turn there. I'm just talking about that in passing. Go to Genesis 21. He sets a covenant with creation after the flood, and he says, "I set a covenant with Abraham and with all of creation that I will never strike the earth again and drown its inhabitants." So that kind of creational covenant is always in play. To be sure, we know that in Genesis 12, he sets up that covenant with Abram. That's probably maybe the most famous covenant, the one that's most well known. At times, the covenant that God has established with Noah doesn't really receive even lip service of much, but the one with Abram is key, right? It's one that is pretty powerful because it sets the tone for what God will do with Israel. And then there's also the covenant ratification ceremony in Genesis 15. And in this case, I'll be mentioning some passages along the way that I don't read. So you can just take note of them and go back and read them later. Okay? Although this is not like one of the videos where you can pause me. So you just have to take note of it. So anyway, we have that covenant ceremony where God splits Abraham splits the animals in half. And after God splits the animals in half, Abraham falls into a trance, a vision, and you can see, right? He sees the torch and the cauldron passing in between the halves of the animals. And in a ratification ceremony for a covenant, the parties to the covenant were to walk in between those cut halves. But in this case, in Abram's vision, he only sees God passing through, or you can see tokens, symbols of God passing in between the covenants. So you can already tell from the very beginning that that God is set to be completely faithful to His covenant, and maybe He anticipates that human beings are not going to be, although He expects them to be and desires them to be to do so. But I think first and foremost, to know that God's faithfulness is completely bound to these covenants is very, very, very encouraging. But here in Genesis 21, we finally arrive in verses 22. I think you could see, right? It says, "Now it came about that at the same time that Abimelech, with Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, 'God is with you in all that you do. So now make a covenant to me here, by God, that you will not violate your word with me, or with my descendants, or with my offspring. As I have shown loyalty to you, show the same to me and to the land in which you have lived as an outsider.' Abraham said, 'I make a pledge,' or sometimes it's written, 'I make a covenant.' Now Abraham had rebuked Abimelech because of the well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. So Abimelech said, 'I don't know who did this thing, nor did you tell me, nor did I hear about it until today.' Then Abraham took a flock of sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant." Okay. In fact, let's read a little bit more. Abraham set 7 young ewe lambs apart from the flock of sheep by themselves. Abimelech said to Abraham, "What do these 7 ewe lambs that you've set by themselves mean?" He said, "You are to accept the 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that they may be a witness for me that I dug this well. That is why that place is named Beersheba, because that's where both of them made a pledge. And they made a covenant in Beersheba." Then Abimelech got up with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Okay, that's one of the first, right? But you notice what's at play here, right? Abraham doesn't just simply say, "Hey, I want to settle this conflict between us," right? And this, of course, is in the context of Abraham settling around the area of the Promised Land in Canaan. When conflict arises, or when potential disagreement, when you anticipate that something may happen, or something has already happened that will divide 2 groups of people, Abraham says, "I'm going to set up a covenant. I want to set up a covenant with you," and does so, in this case, yes, in a ceremonial fashion. He sets aside, right, He says, I don't want us to fight, so I'm going to set up this, as he says here, I'm going to dig a well, and so that it can be used without there being conflict or disagreement between my folks and yours. And so they decide that's how we'll do it. But he says it in terms of covenant. He doesn't just say, this is what I'm going to do. For that context, it's too loose. For that kind of situation, that's too loose of a statement to make. Instead, he says, look, I am setting aside a certain amount of ewe lambs in accordance with my agreement, and I'm setting a covenant with you of access to wells for watering animals. And that's what we would probably say nowadays, you have my word. But again, it begs the question, why use the language of covenant? Why use that rather than I give you my word? Or maybe that's a good replacement. But when you make a covenant, it's binding, right? And it's maybe at times, I know I've thought that I don't use that word because I don't want to violate, the injunction of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, let your yes be yes and your no be no. But a covenant is not like you're swearing necessarily. It's not that. It's simply one where you've made an agreement with one other person in order to, right, you could either avoid conflict, but not just that, but also to settle and build a peaceful solution to something moving forward. Anyway, Genesis 26, a couple chapters later, we'll just now survey a few, one after the other. So here's confirming a covenant with Isaac. This is an agreement to have peaceful relations and not attack each other. And this is Isaac and Abimelech, right in verse 25. And notice how they build, how they name a place after a covenant that's been made, so that every time someone passes through that place, they remember this is where the Berit was made. This is where a covenant was made that people in that area or in that family recognize. Everyone recognizes, yeah, that is a covenant that is binding, and it was marked as in remembrance at that site. So, covenant of Isaac and Abimelech. I'll just start in verse 25, the section before. So he built an altar there and called on the name of Adonai. He pitched his tent there, and Isaac's servants hollowed out a well there. Notice here, it's kind of interesting, the connection between covenants and wells. Now Abimelech went to him from Gerar, him being Isaac, along with Akuzat his friend and Phicol the commander of his army. Isaac said to them, why have you come to me, since you hate me and sent me away from you? They said, we've clearly seen that Adonai has been with you, so we said, let there now be an agreement between us and you, and let us make a covenant with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we haven't touched you, and just as we did nothing to you but good, and sent you away in shalom. You are now blessed by Adonai, right? Blessed by the Lord, I think you may have in a lot of your Bibles. David and Jonathan make an agreement to protect each other, right, in 1 Samuel 23. That's a little outside of the bounds of this section that we're now doing. Then David and the elders of Hebron in 1 Chronicles 11, they make a covenant with one another. And then Solomon and Hiram in 1 Kings 5 also make a covenant with one another to keep their kingdoms, right, in a peaceful and productive relationship. So you can see there's plenty of covenants that are being established here. In this case, the covenants are formal agreements between two parties to agree to a set of promises. We will not do this or that, right? And usually here it's so that they can work together towards some kind of goal. But again, it's an agreement between two parties to adhere to certain promises, all in the service of some kind of common goal. So perhaps there is a place, right, for covenant, even in human relationships. But let's just, I think a more important thing here as well is to understand that none of any human covenants here were done in isolation from the covenant that they may have with a deity. And there were quite a bit of deity covenants that were modeled after suzerain treaties, which is what the Levinson excerpt that I sent to you discusses. When you entered a covenant, it was solemnly binding, meaning it's seriously binding on your life. This is not something that, hey, if it works out, that's cool. Or if I'm in the mood, that'll work out. If everything fits the way I like it, then I'll adhere to it. No, it was you entered full-fledged life into this into the covenant, and so this is the language of God, right? Of Yahweh. He enters into a covenant with Israel, just like a lot of different individual right people groups were entering into some sort of apparent covenant with a deity or with a king. And when one did so, it was very, very important. I think that it's safe to say, right, that any covenant, right, that we embrace, and we know we embrace, right, the new covenant in Jesus, the Messiah, that if we're going to understand that one, we should understand the character of covenants, and we should understand the character of the God that initiated the covenant, because this is one that He initiated, not us. So any of our individual covenants or agreements all occur within the context of a covenant with God. So that I wanted to just give you a brief reading of some between human beings before we kind of set the tone of the covenant that God sets up with human beings. And of course, the broadest one that we know of, even though in Genesis 1 through 3, the word covenant is never mentioned. But I think it's safe to say, right, that God initiates with us human beings in Genesis 1 through 3 in the garden something very similar, very, very similar to a covenant. And this is why. And this is what's, I guess, probably most important for our understanding, of the way that covenant works, and that covenant even influences and shapes us in our ministries today. When God sets up, when God establishes the earth, right? It says in the very beginning in Genesis, as I mentioned in the pre-recorded lecture, that God established human beings in Genesis 1, verse 27. God created humankind in His image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female. He created them. Right? Notice how often the word "created" is repeated. So there's two key terms here. There's bara, which is for create. Only God creates. He's the only one who creates in all of Genesis 1. That is that verb. He's the only subject to that with that verb in all of Genesis 1. He's the one that creates. And he seems pretty adamant when you look at the repetition of the word create to make clear that this is something that God uniquely, right, or intentionally placed himself, that he's positioned himself into carrying out. Right, he created all the world, but then he created human beings in his image. And one of the probably, most one of the clearest, you could say, bits of direction that you can give yourself when reading the Old Testament or anything is simply look at repetition of themes and repetition of key words. Create is an obvious one here. And then the other one that's not as obvious is selem. That's the word for image, which is a statue. As I mentioned in that video, or as you'll see when you listen to that video, right, we're prohibited from making a statue or a graven image of God in Exodus 20, right, when the Ten Commandments are introduced. But God makes a statue of himself in human beings, which is a little weird. But nonetheless, he says, we are his image bearers on this earth. When we view all of the ministry of Jesus and the new covenant that he's established, the broadest possible context that is relevant is the fact that human beings must be restored and must take up their right position as an image bearer of God on the planet Earth. So it's not baldly or nakedly about having our sins forgiven. It's about having our sins forgiven in order to be free to serve as image bearers on the planet Earth. And that's kind of, you could say, our creation-wide commission. And that's what we've been appointed to be, is divine image bearers. And on humanity's part, right, he sets them up. He tells them, I'm going to, right, I've created you in my image. God is even responsive to human needs in chapter 3. It's interesting that God makes Adam as a human being by himself, and then after he's created him, tells, oh, it's not good for him to be alone. Now, if it had been perfect from the very beginning, it would have been fine with Adam to be by himself. But God has actually entered into this sort of dynamic relationship with Adam to the point where God then notices what's wrong. God notices that he should not be alone after he's made him, and then says, I'm going to respond to his situation. Let's get on with it. And of course, he enters that whole process of naming animals and finding which one of these animals is or is not those that should be his partner. None of them, of course, and eventually creates a woman out of the side of his body while he's asleep, no doubt. But when you see, I think you could find some great inspiration here in knowing that he's set a covenant, that is, he's set human beings in his garden temple. The entire world is presented in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and if you want, you can look at the work of John Walton, who I think makes a very convincing argument that the earth is a sort of garden temple. There's a lot of descriptions throughout the Old Testament that liken both the tabernacle and even the temple as a sort of microcosm of the earth. The earth itself is the original garden temple. It's the place of worship. And God is there walking in the midst of what would be considered the pinnacle of that garden. It's the mountain of God, and apparently there's a sort of, on the pinnacle of the mountain of God, there's a garden. And that garden is the Garden of Eden. Right? And there's waters flowing out of it that cascade down. It's a beautiful image. But he says it's at the pinnacle where God dwells, where God has willed to dwell with human beings. And human beings are to serve as the priests of all of creation. Not have a few priests, and then everybody else is some other status, but we're all priests and priestesses of God in creation. So we're tasked with caring for, and tending to the creation, is what it says in Genesis 2:15. Then Adonai Elohim, the Lord God, took the man and gave him rest in the Garden of Eden in order to cultivate and watch over it. Then Adonai Elohim commanded the man, saying, "From all the trees of the garden you are most welcome to eat, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you must not eat, for when you eat from it you most assuredly will die." Okay. This is pretty powerful, all right? But so there's already, I think, you could say a creation-wide covenant in place between God and human beings here that is fractured very, very early on afterwards. And in many ways, we live in the midst of this kind of fracture. We know what the fracture is about because every human being, in a sense, has participated in it. And this is even, independently of Adam or the first, human beings to enter into covenant. It's what human beings have done and do. So what turns out to be the consequence of violating the covenant here is that God has made an abundant earth. He's promised to give an earth that will provide good food and will provide all sorts of other provisions, but human beings violate it. Then the creation becomes as much of a burden as it is a blessing, But the covenant story continues even in light of this. So in part one here, we have a covenant with all of creation. God sets it up so that it's human beings and God and human beings serving as image bearers. If we turn over to Genesis 8, we'll look at then Noah. And in Genesis 8 and 9, we see another set of, it's another covenant. So God, you'd think, would be fed up. I set up a beautiful covenant with you. It's creation-wide. You break it. But instead, he says, okay, that hurts me. And it obviously hurts the relationship in a number of ways. And God responds to it by, in a sense, undoing creation, by again, bringing up the waters of chaos. They recede. We have another Adam. So 10 generations from Adam is Noah. Noah is again a naked man in a garden who's cultivated a vineyard. And again, he engages in a shameful act. God gives yet another covenant. So it goes to show you how faithful he is, to us. And in Genesis 8:18 through 21, I'm going to speed up the pace a little bit here. So Noah comes out, he offers a soothing sacrifice to God, which is the most interesting idea here already. In order to establish the relationship and walk in God's presence, the sacrifice is made. It says, then God spoke to Noah sorry, verse 18. So Noah came out with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. Every animal, every crawling creature, every flying creature, everything that crawls upon the land came out from the ark in their families. Now, this is fairly amazing. Okay, he set up a three-tiered ark, right? Three-story ark. Creation was considered to be three tiers, right? That upper area of the heavens, the earth, and then below the earth in Sheol. The ark is often fashioned as a sort of boat, and that's all it is. It's like a sort of vessel, right? A seafaring vessel. But the way that it's structured is one where, again, it almost seems like it's actually a floating tabernacle. It's a floating worship, right? It's almost, again, a microcosm of the earth. So amazingly, in the midst of this destruction, in the flood, there's this place where the people of God are still engaged in worship. They're still in God's presence, and all of creation is also kept inside of this thing. It's really amazing. So the three-tiered or three-storied nature of the ark is supposed to actually match all of creation, right? Which some of us have probably already intuit that from the fact that every variety of animal that could be found there was placed into the ark. But anyway, it's a very important link, because it goes to show you that we're always called to engage in this worship, right? God has provided means for us to enter into His presence, is how they would have understood it, and we are obliged to follow through. It says in verse 20, then Noah built an altar to Adonai, and he took of every clean domestic animal and every clean flying creature, and he offered burnt offerings on the altar. When Adonai smelled the soothing aroma, Adonai said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, even though the inclination of the heart of humankind is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again smite all living creatures, as I have done. While all the days of the land remain, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. The exact same injunction he had made, of course, to Adam and Eve. So notice, it's a reestablishment of the covenant. God enters into it again, even though he knows human beings' tendency towards selfishness and evil. That's really important, right, to grasp. And I think God wants to show as well that the earth will be a reliable place to live, right? It's not going to have these massive floods every year, so it's not that won't happen on my account. And what is creation's part in this covenant? Nothing. He doesn't require a thing in this one. He doesn't say. He just says, "This is what I'm going to do," and he signs it with a rainbow. Right in chapter 9, what we just started reading, verse 12. This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. My rainbow do I place in the cloud, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the land. Right. So I mean, it's quite powerful. Let's move on to Abraham. So we already know now, and we've established that God has a penchant for establishing covenants. In chapter 12, we see here 12, 15, and 17 are really the most important ones. Now, this is after God has scattered the nations all over the earth. He had made human beings to scatter, right, to go and multiply over the earth and serve as his kingdom of priests all over creation, to tend and care, right, and live and flourish, and help all of creation flourish under their care. Instead, human beings were trying to concentrate themselves in this attempt to reach God, right, on their ingenuity and genius. And instead, God basically smacks them out of there in every direction possible. So God's part here in chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, and 6 and 7 is what I'll read. Hopefully you're keeping up. Just trying to cover some of this material before we hit a break.
Come on, Gabe.
It says here, then Adonai said to Abram, get going out from your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. My heart's desire is to make you into a great nation, to bless you, to make your name great, so that you may be a blessing. My desire is to bless those who bless you, but whoever curses you, I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abram went, just as Adonai had spoken to him. Also Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So he had a fairly comfortable life out in Haran in Mesopotamia, and he left. Right? I'm sure he was affluent. That's where all the earliest cities in the Indus River Valley, in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, those were all the early cities of the earliest civilizations were located. And they left to go to the land of Canaan, and they entered the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the place of Shechem, as far as Moreh's big tree. The Canaanites were in the land then. Then Adonai appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your seed. So there he built an altar to Adonai, who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the mountain to the east of Bethel and erected his tent, with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built an altar to Adonai and called on the name of Adonai, so Abram kept on journeying southward. Again, notice this building of altars in order to commemorate and to establish a habitual practice of turning to God in the land. So now it's a little interesting, right? Now God does actually make a very specific demand. God says, I'm entering into a covenant with you, right? We have a berit, and I will promise to bless Abraham. I will promise to make a huge family out of Abraham's descendants, and I will promise to give them this land. And somehow God's going to do this, okay? Out of this family and from a man who had been living probably affluently or comfortably east, right, of what was known as right east of the garden. And noting, being east of Eden is a place where people are farther and farther and farther from God. And bringing them back west is to bring them back to God's presence. Notice, Cain is exiled to the east. There's a lot of very interesting geographic references to east and west in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, and usually moving east is not a good sign. Going west, remember the three magi, as we like to call them, coming from the east to the west, right? There's already a subtext flowing here that human beings were very close to God, walking with Him, and then sort of get scattered, and they have to figure out a way of not perpetuating the distance from themselves and God, but instead coming back, how to reestablish that connection and that presence. So that's what God promises. Abraham is asked to respond in a number of ways. Trust God's promises. We've heard that a million times, right? And follow this Adonai, right? This covenant God, wherever He leads him in this land that he doesn't know anything about, right? That he'd never lived there. He has to actually train up his family to do what is just and right by following God's commands. And if you want some scripture references for this, to trust God's promises are there in Genesis 12:1. I think that's implied. Also in chapter 15, 1 through 6, that cutting a covenant ceremony is one that's all about trusting His faithfulness. God is putting Himself on the line for them. Train up the family is in Genesis 18, 16 through 19. Okay, that's relevant as well. Where Abraham intercedes. I think the covenant of circumcision, or that's more like a covenant sign. That's a sign that you are in a covenant with God. Of circumcision in chapter 17, even though I didn't have that in my notes originally, is important to know. But anyway, circumcising all the males in the family as a sign of the covenant is important. So Genesis 12, Genesis 18, training up the family, and then circumcising all the males in the family as a sign of the covenant in Genesis 17 is key. In fact, just as a small digression here, before we take a little break, I'm just going to mention a couple other covenants in passing. The covenant of circumcision was meant as a sign to the flesh. Right, it was a strike to the flesh of the male from his reproductive, right, against his reproductive organs in order to humble, right, to show that at the core, in this case, males are carrying the mark. At the core of their identity, they are people who have struck their flesh. That is, those who do not rely on just the potential and sheer power, right, and generativity of the flesh, if that makes sense, right. So the strike on the male in circumcision was to show that whoever, right, comes along in this, right, in this covenant in posterity, that is, all the descendants that come along in life, every time, right, there is a newborn, a new member of this, right, that lives into this or is born into this covenant, it is only done by God's gracious kindness, right? God's kindness is running through that whole thing. How do you know? Well, he struck the reproductive organ of every male to know that he cannot rely on his flesh and the power of his flesh alone, but instead must live, must live instead on God's promises. So that's why it's a sign of the covenant. When you wonder why of all the signs you could have tattooed something, you could have cut your hair a certain way, you could have done all sorts of things. Well, if you strike the reproductive organ, that actually is one great way of knowing if anything lives on, it's because of God's gracious will. All right. And then finally, the others that, of course, I'll mention here is in Exodus 19, we know here it's the covenant with Israel. In fact, all of Exodus 19 to 24 makes it pretty clear what God wants to do. And for God's part, right, we know in Exodus he rescues them, right? In fact, let me read a section from Exodus 3. There'll be a few images that I'll show you when we talk about sacrifice. We're going to look at an image of the entire tabernacle and encampment of Israel, and also look at an image of the tabernacle itself. So hopefully this hasn't been too dry just listening to me, and that you've been looking at the Bible instead of the screen. In Exodus 3, right, verse 7, it says, "Then Adonai said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their slave masters, for I know their pains. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land into a good and large land, a land flowing with milk and honey, into the place of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Now behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. Moreover, I have seen the oppression that the Egyptians have inflicted on them." It's twofold, right, repetition of I hear and I will respond. And he eventually makes it clear, right, when he tells Moses, "You will tell them that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." In other words, I am the God who set up a covenant with all those men and their families, and I'm back. And I will fulfill, right, my covenant. Now, Israel's part in this covenant comes through in Exodus 20 to 23. Okay, Exodus 20 to 23. And that'll be worth your while to read on your own. Exodus 20, verse 21 to 23, verse 19. And after, of course, the 10 words or 10 commandments have been established in Exodus 20, there's then this, right, they stand far off and they agree to the covenant. I mean, the entire mountain it's almost as if they're approaching, right, it's before the tabernacle was even around, they're approaching a tabernacle, right? They're approaching a temple. The mountain pretty much represents this temple. And it's so, I guess, intense that they can't even touch the base of this thing. Only Moses can go up and retrieve the terms of the covenant, and they come on down. And after the 10 Commandments, there's a section that we usually don't like to read. It seems a little boring and irrelevant to us, right? That whole section of case law, especially that extends from chapter 21, verse 1 to 22:16. That case law, if you want to call it that, it very much parallels the ancient Near Eastern law codes. It actually discusses very, very similar topics, and at times even actually has very similar terms to a violation. I mean, and it covers everything in life. Okay, the entire Torah and all of its little Torahs or case laws, I mean, it covers every aspect of life. It's not just what you do when you go worship God or bring an offering to God. It covers a lot of little individual, right, nooks and crannies of life, including, what do you do when your neighbor's ox dies accidentally? What do you do when so and so, when you accidentally harm this or that? How do you, right? How do you carry out restitution in such and such situations? Some of them pretty obscure. But after that section of 21:1 to 22:16, there's another section, right, that some scholars kind of call Yahwistic laws, and those run right from I would call it from 20, obviously 20 verses 22 to 26, and I think when you take a look at those, you'll see that right, that's where the Ten Commandments are located. And then there's another group in 22:17 to 23:19. So again, from 22:17 to 23:19, those are Torah. That's instruction that's very dynamic and distinctive, and very much is rooted in God's relationship, right, or Yahweh's relationship with these Hebrews, and that's what starts setting them apart. They set up this system just like many other nations of the time set up their systems, and in fact, they sort of share, right, in their language. They share very similar terms of devotion and promise and consequence for violating those terms. But in the heart of it, there's this very, very distinctive set of Torah, of instruction, that God says this is rooted in our relationship. This is the engine of the whole thing. And in those, right, they set themselves apart. This is where the holiness issue comes in. They live out of the heart of God's compassion. So when you read that section, you see, especially in chapter 23, that God's distinctive character is to be shared by the people he has called to covenant. They are to have a distinctive character as well. In fact, in 23 verse 9, after that whole catalog, right, of things that they are to do in relation to the vulnerable, the debtors, the widows, the orphans, the sojourners, right? Sojourners very commonly became indebted and fell into the slavery in a host country, so very far away from their home country. And it was a usually very terrifying experience. And it says in verse 9, "You shall not oppress the stranger. You know the heart of the stranger." And then he goes on to tell them, because remember, you were one and I delivered you from that. So that's a very powerful passage that speaks to the fact that they are supposed to live out of their relationship with God, not just simply out of the general laws of the land that are already out and about and are fairly well established. They are supposed to live out of the distinctive heart of God. And so that's yet another covenant that's been set up, and that is a covenant where God has chosen Israel as a covenant people to make them name to a priestly nation that will represent God's character out in the world. It's supposed to be a further fulfillment of what he had promised to Abraham in chapter 12 of Genesis. Okay? Remember, that was the original intent, is that all human beings would be an image bearer of God. Abraham was a more sort of narrow approach to this mission, and now, right, he set up all these descendants, this family that will serve as priests and priestesses in this covenant. And then lastly, it's of course the covenant with David. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because it's not as relevant to this section. When we talk about the monarchy, we'll talk more about that. Right, but just you can take note of it, right, in 2 Samuel 7 and even Psalms 72 and 89 and 132. Psalms, again, I said 72, 89, 132. There's a lot of talk of God's covenant, right, with David, that he would always have a descendant on his throne, and that God would use this descendant to also further his covenant. So I hope that that's been a fairly good overview here at the time, and I'm going to leave it up to you to see how God's covenant with Abraham and Israel and David figures into your understanding of Jesus' covenant, right? And even why Jesus wanted to have 12 apostles, and why he wanted them to be judges of Israel. Right, but let's just we'll take about 10 minutes here. It's 8:53. We'll take a break pretty much from 8:53 to or 8:54 now, 8:54 to 9:04. And if anything, if you want, take some time just simply to reflect. What has this material on God's covenant how can it inform and shape my own understanding? Maybe write about what's new. What's something, a new vista or perspective that you hadn't thought about with God that has immediate bearing on your own spiritual life as a leader, or your own spiritual life, or even in ministry. Or if you want something a little bit more concrete to do, if you don't just simply want to reflect in general and take down notes, maybe you could read the Genesis 15 covenant ratification ceremony, right, the cutting of the covenant in Genesis 15, and notice that Abraham is asleep on the ground while God is carrying out this ceremony. And why do you think this is important? What do you think is significant about that? So let's take 10, and we'll be back at it in 10. We'll talk about holiness. All right. Thanks very much. All right. It always feels like we're part of some sort of studio, the news. So thank you for reporting from the field. Back to the studio. Felt I need to say that. One experience it otherwise. All right. Now there was like Matt said. I second it. Keep the feedback coming, because we're just kind of, you could say, learning to do this as we go along. And there are two questions that came through. One from Luke. Luke asked a question about the readings that were mentioned, I believe, in the beginning of this session. So very quickly, when you go onto the Canvas website, the course site, in other words, there's a series of sort of tabs and options on the left-hand side, and there's one, of course, that says readings, and another one that says, well, assignments. But if you pick assignments, it will lead you to a set of options where you can pick the OTS reading, and reading one includes. There's a book by Dempster, last name Dempster, called Dominion and Dynasty, and that's actually probably the most substantial bit of reading, because there you have to read several chapters that run pretty much through all of the first 5 books, and then into some Joshua and Judges. But Joshua and Judges, we're going to use that as a kind of launch point, as a connection between this and the next one. But so that's not necessarily a central Joshua and Judges to what we're doing here. But you want to read that, and then there's also little excerpts that have been embedded as PDFs on the site. One from John Levinson, who's a Jewish scholar, and you read that one, and that one's pretty short. I think it may be, I don't know, 8, 9 pages. And then there's another from Walter Kaiser's book, Mission in the Old Testament, that may be a little longer, but it's actually a very small book as far as its dimensions. I think that may be 14, 15, or 16 pages. So anyway, the two PDFs are not very long in tandem. The Dempster readings from Dominion and Dynasty, which is a book that you can get as an ebook for about $15, is you could say the more substantial bit of reading. So anyway, I hope that answers that question. The other, as far as what to emphasize in your own study, the things that I would want you to at least remember for the sake of the exam, and I always tried to resist this when I taught all those years, but it is relevant, and I would make study guides and things like that to make sure folks are not emphasizing the things they shouldn't. But I think here, in terms of what we just discussed, I want you to remember each of those covenants. That is the one with creation, the one, right, well, with human beings in Genesis 1, with creation after the flood, with Abram, right, with Israel in the desert, and Exodus right, 23 and so on. And obviously, we probably know about the new covenant, but I want you to remember those covenants. The covenant with David, of course, is included there, but I'd like for you to remember what covenants there are and some kind of passage, right? At least one scripture from the ones that I gave you that are correspond to each of those covenants. Okay. And remember who's involved with those, which would be part of that's part of the content intrinsic to that covenant. How many covenants are there? With whom does he set him? And the passages, right, or the passage, in some cases just a passage, where that covenant is introduced and elaborated. Okay? The main emphasis here is that you think about these in terms of ministry. Then there will be a little study guide that I'll create I will identify a few different characters, a few very important figures, and I do want you to remember those figures. And I also have a little, if it's not a timeline, it'll have some important dates that correspond or that are associated with each of those characters. It'll be a fairly simple outline, but I also want you to be aware of those. So those are forthcoming, and you'll end up seeing references to those in the readings as they come along. So not too many. So that's I hope that's helpful in some way. I'll also make sure that I mention as I move along here that what things are more important than others, and so that you can place due emphasis on that. Okay, so let's talk about holiness. Okay, I think first and foremost we ask ourselves, just as we did before, what is a covenant? What is holiness? I think we have a sort of pervasive or common cultural understanding in the U.S. of what holiness is, and then I do think that there's a biblical meaning, and they don't overlap. They don't perfectly overlap, that's for sure. I think when people see, oh, that's a holy person, and you're so holy. Holy cow, you're holy. I don't, but I think we see it mostly in, we see it mostly in kind of moral terms, right? That person is holy because of their moral goodness, and in that sense, there's something accurate to that. But there's actually something a little bit more, there's I guess something greater or more, that is, it includes a good bit more around that concept of holiness than just moral goodness, moral exemplar. Wow, they're so morally upright. Most of the time when people use the word holy in normal conversation, however, it's usually not good. It's not being carried right for good terms. Like, oh, that person's holier than thou. Holy, and it's more than anything an insult, used pejoratively. More often than not. So we want to talk about holiness here, and probably one of the best analogies that I've seen about holiness is the sun. That you can kind of view the sun as an analog to holiness. The sun is incredibly unique and powerful, and a source, right? It's a source of life. But it's unique, it's pure, it's powerful, and of course, the closer you get to it, the more dangerous it becomes. However, it doesn't just, in a sense, exude holiness for itself. It isn't simply holy for its own sake. There's a sort of, right, when you look at that kind of aura of the sun, when you look at the aura of the sun, you know that that the edges of the sun, its light spreads in all directions and casts itself on all that surrounds it and gives it. Well, obviously, in our case, it illuminates everything that it touches. So it shares, right? It shares its own light and uniqueness and power to other things. Okay, and you can kind of call those set of emanations or that influence that the sun has as kind of intensities of holiness. If you were to get too close, it would not be good. So I think one writer called it, that holiness is God's dangerous goodness. And I think that that's probably a very good way of putting it. biblically speaking, I forgot where I put my Bible here. Here it is. Um, okay, it's I think I mean in its own right, the word unique. I mean the word holy is supposed to denote uniqueness. It's supposed to denote something that's been set apart, something onto which you can set your focus, right? That captures your attention, that directs you, that shows you, right, or demonstrates to you something important. That is, just like a frame, right, for a painting. If that painting did not have that frame, it would sort of blend into the profane, into everything that's common around it. So the holiness is kind of something that is in the Hebrew. I think in the Hebrew it denotes that it's something that is set apart and that focuses our attention. And in the Bible, the first two things that are denoted as holy are, you probably guessed it, the Sabbath day, right there in Genesis 2:3, God sanctifies it, makes it holy by setting it apart as a day of rest. And some of us are thinking, "Amen for rest," right? But so that's part of the rest is part of God's delight in creation. That creation is meant to not just simply labor on and on, but it's actually supposed to rest in God's own goodness. And then the second thing is the holy ground around the burning bush of God's presence. That actually is a good one to associate with the image of the sun, right? Because it's God's presence is so powerful and unique that it makes the area surrounding the bush holy. He tells them, "Take off your sandals and set them apart." Right, set it aside because what you're standing on is holy. That already starts signaling to you that from God's presence emanates this kind of holiness that attracts people's attention because of the uniqueness and the power that's there, and because it's a source of life coming at you, right, and inviting you to it. But once you recognize that holiness, you realize that I can't just do things willy-nilly the way I want. Right, I can't, in a sense, define this space the way I want. I can't define the people the way I want. I can't define things. And in the Bible, all of those things can be holy. People, places, things, even time. Right, as if you look at Leviticus 23, 1 through 2, that's just kind of an extra reference to give to you, not absolutely essential. But in the Bible, all those things can be holy if they participate in God. The Hebrew word is kadosh, and you sometimes will hear people say the kadosh. The kadosh, is different, somewhat variations on the term holy. Is also used to describe a blessing on something. Like when you bless something, you are people are making references to Nacho Libre, which is pretty funny. Thank you, Kurt. Right, but you want to set apart those things in order to participate in God's dangerous goodness. God is first called holy in Exodus 15:11. And the context of that, I think, is probably key. This little unit, by the way, is not going to be as long as the one before. I want you to take some time to think through this and even write some comments. But notice the context is the song of Moses and Miriam after the Israelites have been delivered from the clutches of the Egyptians, not only, of course, in the city, but as they've been chased. Even there's also a passage in 1 Samuel 2, there is no one holy like Adonai, there is no one besides you. But in Exodus 15, it's a very, very beautiful and powerful song. I will sing to Adonai, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. In verse 5, the deeps cover them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Adonai, is glorious in power. Your right hand, Adonai, dashes the enemy to pieces. And then eventually we get to verse 10. You blew with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, Adonai, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, awesome in praises, doing wonders? Okay, so God's holiness is really tied here to two things. One is, back at the beginning, right, he has the power, of course, to make all things tov, to make all things good. And so his holiness is set apart by the fact that he's the only one that's the creator. There's nobody else that does it. So his holiness is established by the fact that he's the creator and author of life, right? And he kind of is the one who imbues everything with its life-giving, right, properties, soil, tree, right, everything that we know, air, and so forth. And then God's holiness is connected to, as it says in the passage that we just read from Exodus 15, that he's morally good. That is, he only wills the good. And that's primarily what his purity is about. He is just so, so good. I mean, almost inscrutably and ineffably so. That is, you can't even begin to define, in some ways, how good God is. So I think that that's something that we take to mind here, is that God's power and purity creates this sort of paradox. How can God be so good and so pure in his goodness, you could say, and then live in the midst of human beings? Right? This creates that kind of paradox for us. And that's where we kind of get, of course, into this right into this idea of what God has provided that welcomes access, that welcomes relationship. Holiness in this case is not just God's own uniqueness, right, and ultimacy as the creator and as the one who is good, right, is morally good, is righteous and just. But this holiness is also what will invite people back to him, even though that's not how the Old Testament, that is especially law and the setting up of the tabernacle, is read. The setting up of the tabernacle is read more like, man, look at all this stuff you have to do because God is so distant. The one thing to remember here is that everything that we read about God's holiness, and especially in this, and we read about the sanctuary or the tabernacle, assumes that there's already distance, right? Distance has already been there. When we start from human beings with God in the garden, they sort of spread out, right? In this case, they better maybe said that they cast eastward. And God is then trying to sort of, let me keep you near me. And in fact, I'm going to set something up with, I'm going to set something up through a particular people, and I will set certain terms to make sure that, hey, when I'm approached, we can have fellowship. It's one thing to approach somebody. It's another thing to have fellowship with them. And so that's what God wants to set the terms to. He says, you guys have been violent. Your inclinations of your heart have been corrupted. I want to be with you. Do you want to be with me? If so, I'm going to set the terms. Remember, he's the one that also initiated this covenant. So he says, I'm going to initiate this covenant with you. This is, I think, where God's holiness becomes so powerful. And even though I'm now going to refer to passages later on, when you think about the vision of Isaiah in Isaiah 6, where the cherubim takes a piece of coal, right, and touches the lip of Isaiah, right, the coal is kind of the burning, right, it's the burning holiness of God, and it touches him and it purifies him. And then we know even, that there's division in Ezekiel of the water leaving the temple, and everything that it touches leads to life. And of course, now think about Jesus, who touches the unclean rather than avoids them. So you could already see that it's very easy to distort holiness as I'm setting myself apart for God, but away from everybody else. Or I'm, doing everything that I need to do to enter God's presence, all the while, right, not purifying myself from the inside out. But the whole point here is that the sanctuary was just yet one other thing that taught Israel how important it was to draw near to God, but that it couldn't just be done on a whim. It couldn't just be done, right, according to mood or anything like that. So I'm going to share an image here. Let's take a look at the setup of, right here in holiness, we're going to talk about the sanctuary. Later on, we'll add the component of sacrifice, even though I'll mention a little bit about it here. So let me share the screen. Matt made that funny comment about me using, I think, Microsoft Edge. The computer that I'm using was just repaired, and they pretty much had to wipe it clean. So there's a number of things here that I have to kind of upgrade. Nonetheless, I hope it works. So someone send me a signal if the screen share doesn't work. Okay. So anyway, I'm going to share screen. I think you can probably see myself now. All right. So here is. Let's see. Is it? All right. I hope it's sharing. All right. I think it's not now. It's sharing the screen, right? All right. Thank you, Amy. All right. So you see here this image. There's obviously a whole lot of these on the internet. You notice, of course, the tabernacle has been set up here in the middle, and notice the encampment, of course, all around, and it's done, of course, by layers. When you read Exodus, when one reads Exodus 25, right there, and through 26, 27, 28, 29, there's an extensive amount of text here on how to design, on the dimensions of the tabernacle, and also even defines the individual implements or even furniture that's supposed to be in there. Right, so it kind of defines what is supposed to be in it. After that, right, once you get to chapters 37, 38, and 39, they actually build it, right, or I should say chapter 40, they actually build the whole thing and finalize it. But there's something very important to know here about the holiness of God. Imagine viewing this whole thing like the image of the sun. The very center here where I'm holding the icon is the holy, right, or right here in the back of the tabernacle is the Holy of Holies. And we'll take a look at another image that takes us inside here. But this is the place of holiness. This actually shows that God does want to dwell with human beings. There is already a lot of distance, but here is one where this is the case where God is saying, I'm actually willing to travel with you. You don't have to come to one spot. Right? In a sense, I cast you out of there. But now God is starting to repair the torn fabric of the relationship. And he is saying, I'm going to go along with you, but if you're going to approach me and have fellowship with me, it has to follow certain terms. Right? I'm the one who initiated these promises. I want to fulfill these promises with you, but you have to allow yourself to be trained to enter my presence and live with me. And so this is what's set up. These little, right, the arrangement here of having certain tribes in certain locations, you can read about that in Numbers, especially in the first few chapters of Numbers. There's, of course, those long genealogies that we do not like to read. But one question you could ask yourself, why would genealogies be important for establishing, right, especially for establishing yourself as a member of this covenant? Right, and that pretty much answers its own question. But why? Why keep up from one generation to the next? Right, look into the character of God, and that will answer that. But they set the terms of who will be located where. This inner circle right here is primarily Levites. Levites are not identical with Aaronic priests. When you read the Exodus account of the Israelites creating a golden calf, of course against God's wishes, in that pretty horrible scene. Right, in that situation, the ones who joined Moses in chapter 32 to slay the unfortunate fellow brothers and sisters are the Levites. They're the sons of Levi. And so the sons of Levi were granted this position to be those who take care of the implements and the items inside of the tabernacle and in this general, right, courtyard area. The Aaronic priests actually carry out the ceremonies. The Levites, by and large, the Kohen, as they sometimes would be called, right, the Levites just simply take care of washing the basins, cleaning the altar, doing things like that. But at the center is the most intense area of holiness. In the courtyard is another gradation or level of holiness that's not as intense as the one in here. And then the holiness is supposed to emanate outwards in every direction to touch all of the human beings. So if you're going to get close to this, you have to answer to the intensity of holiness as you get closer and closer and closer. I hope that makes sense. Okay? So again, this assumes that there's distance between human beings and God, but distance that God wants to bridge. Okay? Not distance that God wants to aggravate. All right? That he wants to, in a sense, make worse. This is actually part of all of God's desire to, to heal human beings. And as you can see, I need to plug in my my computer here. All right. So anyway, let me go over to the tabernacle. Well, actually, let's mention one other thing. The sanctuaries that were set up by other ancient Near Eastern peoples did not have images inside of it like that of the tabernacle, if that makes sense. When you walked into this tabernacle, it had images of pomegranates, trees, fruit, lush green gardens. In other words, it reproduced the garden inside of it. It reproduced, maybe the best way of putting it, it reproduced the cosmos, an experience. Maybe the word shouldn't be experience, but it made clear to you that you're now entering a restored space with God in creation. But other ancient Near Eastern temples had images of gods fighting one another and of victorious battles. But inside of the tabernacle, that is all of the drapery, and the tapestries, all of that stuff had beautiful interweave knitting and sewn images of garden scenery, all right, and garden fruit. So the dead, there's also images of the dead in other Babylonian and Greek temples when you take a look at images of those. But the dead had no place, okay, in the temple of Israel, including, of course, the early sanctuary. Before it began. Give me a moment here so I can plug in my my computer. Just enjoy the image. All right. Here we go. That's right. No music. All right. Or no lecture. Clap, 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 clap. No lecture. All right. So you can see then that this tabernacle very much signifies restricted access to the presence of Yahweh, but it also gives you all of the terms needed to draw near. And of course, that's where one purified themselves. I want to make clear here that being impure, according to this Old Covenant law, was not the same as being sinful. So just make sure that it doesn't necessarily, it may include that, but it does not actually necessarily mean that one is sinful. Okay, I hope that's clear, and there's maybe another time I could elaborate on that. But once again, there's gradations of holiness even inside of the tabernacle. Right? There's also gradations of holiness in the people who use it. The high priest is the most holy. Right? The priests are holy. The laity can come into the courtyard. The sojourners in the land, and then, right, the idea that when you were out in the hollow waste area, you were far from the presence of God, was a way that they understood the geography of the time. Even the animals, the goat was probably considered, the most holy because the high priest carried the goat, the blood of the goat, into the Holy of Holies. A bull, probably holy. The lambs offered in the courtyard, right, could be also considered, right, there was kind of the next level of holiness. Then there's clean animals that live in the land, and then unclean animals that live, right, farther out and about, that they were not supposed to be around. You could even say that for them, the Gentiles were the farthest reach of holiness, right, where holiness may or may not really touch it. But that doesn't mean that Israelites were not supposed to interact with Gentiles. That's not anywhere in the law that forbids interaction with Gentiles. In fact, they're invited as strangers and aliens to be included. And then there's material as well. The pure gold is for the most holy place. Gold and silver for the holy place. Bronze for the courtyard. And then earthen stuff. So you can see what's going on here. Okay, there's all sorts of gradations, of holiness, and all of that was, and again, for a reason. Okay, you can say train, and is almost like a holy pedagogy of the flesh. Right, is to take the flesh that wants to just rely on its own power, on its own potential, on its own on its own strength against its vulnerability, and instead, instead, what God wants to do is slay that kind of living, and in order to do so, He wants to discipline the flesh. That is, He wants to shape it and mold it to live toward to live toward holiness. Okay, so. Let's take a look at an image here of the. Let me find the best one I could find here of the. Here we go. Come on now. Hopefully the resolution will improve. Yesterday it was a good bit better. But I think yeah. Let me go back here. Oh, here's you see another. No, I think the one that we were using is. Yeah. Don't worry about kind of a little bit of the haziness here. Well, let me see if I could find. Here we go. A little better. You can see them here offering. Okay, so we can take a look at a closer image, somewhat closer image here. In this courtyard, there may be some Levites who are watching over the sacrifice that is being offered on the altar, and then there's a wash basin. This is, of course, quite significant, right? You have to encounter fire, there's this fire and water that together kind of purify whoever is going to enter into the most holy place. Now, this is also a place where offerings are made on behalf of Israelites who themselves have to be clean. They have to wash up when they bring their offering here to be received by a priest, who then offers it up. That's important, because this whole Levitical system is a gate, it's kind of, you could say it's a gate ceremony. It's supposed to define how you return and access God. Okay, it's designed for worshipers in the flesh who would be excluded from the full enjoyment of God's presence, but God is welcoming them. And the most unique thing about even the whole sacrificial system of Israel is that God makes it something where He's seeking fellowship, and notice how it's a lot of it is predicated on the idea of a meal. I want you to have fellowship with me. Notice, of course, the